Okay, everybody, we're going to get started with Stephen Hilt, and he's going to be going over, and that went backwards. We're going to be talking with Stephen Hilt here. I'm going to make him presenter, and we'll get started.
Go on webcam here for a minute for you guys. Hi, I'm Stephen Hilt, and this will be my talk about how we reversed engineered multiple industrial radio remote control systems. This project originally started in 2018, was presented a couple times in 2019, and here we are in 2020, the year of the virtual conference, and a bunch of other things that are going on in our lives. So I'm going to go away from the camera here for a little bit so you can focus on my slides and not this. I'll be back for later, and you can answer some questions at the end if you have any. So this project originally started in, as I said, in 2018. And one of the things we were looking to do is find some targets in which we wanted to look at from a reverse engineering stance and get really deep into some wireless RF protocols. And so one of the things that we noticed is that when we drove around to do this research and things like that, we found something interesting that we kept seeing all over the place from coworkers that were on this project with me, from things you could see from your apartment building to this is a shot I took in Tokyo in December 2018. Again, this is when they were ramping up for something that was going to happen this year, which would be the Olympics. So one of the things that I wanted to point out was one of the things that we saw is as you zoom in here is you see all these things off in the distance. So we kept looking and looking, and you see a lot of cranes all over the place. So one of the first things we wanted to look at was cranes. Now there's multiple types of cranes. There's overhead cranes. There's the cranes that we just showed you. There's a bunch of different things. And one thing that's in common with all of them is the way they're controlled. And this is a controller specifically for an overhead crane. This is my coworker Marco. That's actually attached to here. And there's other types of some more simplified, but pretty much the way any of them work is you push up, the crane hoists up, and then there's down, north, south, east, and west. There's some other functions if depending on, but that's the primary functions of all of these. So we wanted to look at, before we started diving into it, where exactly are all these things? Where are they used? Where are these types of controllers used other than maybe just cranes as well? So first thing we'll see is that, much like the previous picture, industrial hoists. They're used in mobile hoists. So the trucks that move around and pick things up as well. Concrete pumps are using these. These are used in agriculture, logistics, forestry, drilling operations. I saw a YouTube video of a continuous miner that's being ran by pretty much the exact same controller I showed you that Marco was wearing. They're used in industrial automation, material mining. Pretty much what we're saying is almost every sector will eventually or has one of these. So this was a very good target for us because it's not just super hyper focused on, say, something like just moving material, say in a steel mill or anything like that. So it's everything from transportation and things like that are using these. So then we wanted to look at, say, market share. So where are the vendors located, things like that. And we found several large vendors based in the highlighted countries. Most of these vendors have been operating for decades, so it's a very mature business with tens of millions of dollars in revenue. So how do they work? the transmitter communicates over wireless to the receiver. The receiver then operates a relay, which then runs a motor. It's pretty simple. So that signal is telling it to run a motor. You can then hook these up to, as I said, anything else you want. So by pressing buttons, you can automate various equipment, and by triggering a switch, you can turn on a motor and things like that. One of the first things we did was get our hardware that we were using. We used both Edis B210s, Blade RFs, some DVT dongles as well to start looking at these systems. We started looking, when we started looking, the first steps that we saw and that we took was to see what we can do with any decoding of any of the messages. As you can see here, we looked at 433.7 megahertz, took the packet, then replayed it at the same 433 megahertz, 0.7 megahertz. So what happened? So on the left side with the record, we're literally recording in GnuRadio at 433.7 megahertz. Then we take what we recorded and replay it. So I'm going to show you a little demo of what happened here. So this is one of the vendors, Juuko. As you can see, the basic operations of up, down, left, right, things like that. And so in the background, we're recording it. Now we'll put the controller down. Okay, so we recorded it. Now let's go through the next step, which is, so now with the controller down and no one's touching it. And in fact, we even took the battery out of the controller, as you can see on the ground, and it's operating the crane from our recorded captures. One of the first things you see on is the relay on the back, all of them lighting up. This is the command that starts the radio, much like the one I showed earlier with the crane here. So then we're just replaying the command. That includes the startup command. So earlier there's a startup sequence before any of the buttons for safety work. So you can actually replay the starting sequence so everything turns on. So what happened is when we replayed the message, it worked. So we wanted to see then what happens if we capture multiple messages to see if we could capture any differences within the packet. So message 1 of up, message 2 of up, message 3, all the messages were the same. So every time we recorded on Juuko, the messages were all the same every time we're hitting the up button. Now, one caveat on this, and one thing we learned through a couple different vendors, and I'll show another one later, is there's different methods in which some of the vendors work on this case. Some of them, it'll be when the button is pushed, it'll hold until the button is released. So it's one signal that says up, and then when you release, it's more or less stops sending up. Some radios, it's a continuous message in the entire time the button is pressed. So one of the things that we did see there was, okay, record and replay. It works. All our vendors that we tested, this worked on. It's super easy. It's super cheap to use. All you have to do is record a message and replay that message. Everyone that we tested was vulnerable to this. To show you it's not just in a lab, here's a real crane in which this is working on. And we should see we hit the stop button that was on the top of it. So that in theory, turns off the relays inside the receiver. So then with our Blade RFs, we are sending a signal to start it up and start moving the crane. And as you can see here, it's a overhead crane that's moving inside of a facility that picks heavy things up and move. The interesting thing here, of course, is that chain swinging around. Now, what's the damage here? Not a whole lot until you get close to those cars and things like that. You could do things, but just in general, it's pretty unfortunate that it's that easy that you can just record and replay a message. I don't know if anyone here has used URH, but this is URH, or the Universal Radio Hacker. So we took most of the items that we had, we put them into URH, and this is where you can see things as well, where we start looking into pre-recorded commands: up, north, down, east. Okay, so now we know what command is north, which one's up, down, east. So once we recorded them and started separating them into that, now we have arbitrary commands. It doesn't have to be one that we record the whole sequence. We then broke it up and chunked it into what we knew each thing was. So for our radios, this worked for each and every other radio we came across. We have to do the same capture for these replays to work. So it's not necessarily something that we really want to do where we record it for every case. What we want to eventually go to is the ability to change, because they have some of the vendors, there's a pairing ID that you have. And so we wanted to kind of reverse how that pairing ID worked and other things like that. So we could figure out if we could do arbitrary command execution where it didn't matter which device we had, we could always figure out how to interface with it and operate it. So we'll go back to our Juuko in this case, and let's look at this vendor where we did a bunch of reversing. So one of the first things we did was open up the case, and the first thing you see is a bunch of relays. When we look a little further, you see that underneath the chip itself, it's a CC 1120 chip with an antenna out. RF analysis, so pretty much what we have, looking at the signal coming out on the chip itself. So we captured the signal, now what? So then we captured the signal, and then we decided that we were going to hook it up to a logic analyzer to try to clean up some of that noise. So we specifically used a tool to emulate SPI operations with a read and write registers. So we created a tool that emulates the SPI. We actually did a talk pretty exclusively on this tool that we built. We gave it an S4 by 19 in Miami. So if you want to see that talk, there's a lot better information there. Partner on this research, Jonathan Anderson, does a way better job of explaining this tool than I ever could, mostly because he wrote it. So go watch that talk if you're really interested, and I can put you in touch with Jonathan as well if you have any questions about it. But what we can see here is what's being accessed, set, and programmed with the tool that we wrote. From there, we can write custom new GnuRadio blocks based on the information that we saw in the SPI. So here's an example of us exercising those complex protocols. These complex protocols are based off the information that we decoded from the radios. So you see things like the preamble sync words address and all those things that we decoded out of it. So then we ended up coming up with this complicated GnuRadio flow graph that would be able to do everything we needed to do in Juuko. Then we dug into the specs, and then we found the frame of the CC 1120 based on the specs here for the data field. So we're going to try to reverse out what is actually in the data field. So we knew the preamble, sync words, trailers, but what's in the data? So there's a custom application protocol with security through obscurity baked in usually. So we have a preamble, sync word, and then the custom application. So when we started looking at the data, you see we have, first thing is a sequential ID. So after the preamble and sync words that we have sequential ID. We were able to get the system to send, we were able to get the system to send with fixed sequential IDs to see what anything else was. Anything else changed or didn't change. So then the next thing we notice is these interesting 5 bytes. It's a typo, sorry. Those 5 bytes seemed interesting to us. Why did they seem interesting to us? It was the ID number on the model itself, or on the sticker inside the case. So then we looked back at the board and remembered it was the ID, and we kept hitting our head on the desk. This actually happened at a team meeting when we were in our offices in Taipei one day to figure it out, that if we just took the pairing code, which can be changed via a USB from what the pairing code, which would be the ID, and then we changed that pairing code to the new pairing code to nothing but zeros, then we come out with the pairing code actually tends to be, so what happened here was, the long story short, is we XORed the data with the pairing code of all zeros with our original data set, and we would get the following, which is our pairing code in Little Indian. So now we know what those 5 bytes in the pairing code are. The next is the command, and you can see it's things like pretty basic information in there. So now we have command injection, not just for our radios, but with some basic lookups, and we created a lookup table so we could pretty much sniff one packet, look up what your pairing code is. Now I can communicate to you, regenerate the packets, things like that, and then send them out. So this came up for any Juuko radio that we found. So it comes up that this is what the protocol looked like for an up command. So pretty much anything you want to do, we can do of any command, including an e-stop button command. So the idea here is that we can take any command that you give us that I see, and I can then change the command to whatever the command I want it to be. And when we send a bunch of e-stops, more or less your crane just stops working. So what if we do that in a loop? Do we actually have a DOS of the production or whatever? So the next one is a little video that we have of us actually doing that. So with the system's running now, and then you can see it doesn't work. Oh wait, hang on, it does work. There, now it's off. So it's just every time you start it, it stops. We just continually run that script. and it will always, it's just constantly telling the Juuko radio that, in that case, to stop. So now we have command injection. So we have record and replays, command injections, a couple other things we want to work on, which was the e-stop abuse and then malicious repairing. So malicious repairing is interesting. So the idea here is that we could see if we could reprogram another controller instead of walking around with all our SDR equipment. Can you buy one of these controllers, then reprogram your controller to work with that system? And so we looked at one of our other radios that we were working with, which was the Saga radio in this case, to see if we could do anything with the firmware or anything like that as well. So this is the USB programming tool that we got, and we looked at the schematics and we found lots of issues once we started looking at this. Not only did Saga have these ports for reprogramming the transmitter, but most of them did, not just Saga. So we're not talking just a Saga thing. We were able to find clear text passwords in transmission. The firmware was unprotected, and we also could forge the integrity checks, which could lead to backdoors on these devices. In short, malicious repairing worked, and we could put rogue firmware on some devices. So with that, we have now, we have our malicious reprogramming. The malicious programming and repairing are a little more on our expensive side in our cases, just because it takes a little extra time and a little extra effort, but is possible from all the devices that we tested. So next we're going to look at possibly how can we do remote, stealthy, and persistent attacks. So here we have a tool that we built custom-wise called RFQuack. You can go to github.com/trendmicro/RFQuack and find all the information you want about it. We've actually done a little bit more work on this tool set since then, but the idea here is we have a remote attacker through a 4G LTE connection, then can transmit and communicate to this. In total, the cost to build one of these is around $40. And here's a little video that we've put together about how it operates. Yeah, and we made it flexible so you can actually use this not just for crane controllers, but any project you're working on. One of the things that we were having issues with in some of the cases with some of the original tool sets that we were trying to use, that just didn't work like we wanted them to. And I reached out to Travis Goodspeed a couple times about some projects, and also Atlas for some of his things as well, that we just couldn't really get working. We actually ended up patching a couple tool sets to see if we could get them to work for us, but that didn't seem to work very well. That's a really good, sorry about that video artifact there. Let me pause it. Okay. Is it flickering for you guys or no? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it seems to be a little slow.
Yeah.
Videos don't do too well across GoToWebinar.
I'll post all these slides to SketchD so you guys can watch the videos if you want. Long story short, by example, we were able to exploit vulnerabilities that we found remotely. So now we can sniff everything we wanted to sniff. We could even then transmit what we wanted to transmit on something that is relatively small.
I do not have legal background. I do not have legal training. If you do something
So we'll, I'll just go ahead and skip this slide because it's not doing so hot. So in other words, we have a flexible tool that can do lots of things that you want it to do. It's just some rewriting some code here and there for it. So if you're interested in it, check it out. If you have any questions, let me know about that tool set. So earlier I mentioned Travis. I'm sure Travis probably actually might be on this call because I gotta give him a big shout out for one of the big successes of this project. So in BSides Knoxville 2018, Travis gave a really good talk on his good watch. And so when I was doing this project, I was sitting there thinking to myself, is it possible for us to take a good watch and control one of the cranes that we had? In essence, I'm going to show you the video from me in 2000 at S4 in 2019. Here, controlling the crane itself here. So this is online, and I'll post the slides as well, so you should be able to see that. If not, as you can see here, here's the good watch controlling our Saga crane. It's going up and down and things like that. So we were able to control the crane from the watch, which is pretty good achievement there, because one of the things I was always joking around, if we can do that, yeah, the RFQuack is really good. We can run it on a battery and you can drop it and you don't have to be near. But how many times are you stopping somebody coming into any of your facilities for wearing a watch? You don't. So if I as an attacker, figure out how to monitor, view, and get all that information, and then can program a watch and then come into your facility and do something, you're never going to question the guy with the watch. That was my approach on it, and so far that's pretty good. I've never got anything that says anybody is really questioning people with watches. So from a disclosure stance, we had only one vendor released a patch. We're not going to go back and police them and check the patch, but 1 out of 7 is pretty sad. One vendor we spoke with in person said that nobody would ever be able to do these attacks. Another vendor approached us and thanked us for our paper because that they were also able to go to talk at DIN, if you want, which is a working group that he's part of, in order to amend existing safety standards, specifically IEC 62745, which is the standard for minimal requirements for functional safety for remote controls. The amendment that he wanted to suggest is including requirements that state standard compliance devices should at least not be affected by simple replay attacks. One vendor in particular threatened legal action against us for having looked at their devices, but now have decided, with much discussions from ZDI, which Trend Micro ZDI is part of, so we have to go through ZDI for our disclosures. With much discussion with ZDI, they have decided to patch, but we haven't seen public evidence of this patch. Overall, the process was painful, which took 30 days more than our usual 90-day disclosure window, so we gave them extra time. I'd say it went worse than typical ICS space vulnerability disclosure, because at least in ICS space, we understand some of it. They understand. Take it, when we were talking to these people, it's like 2006 when we were originally talking to some of the ICS vendors. And we got a question from one vendor even, which was, oh, a vulnerability, what does that mean? Help us understand it. You found a vulnerability. We don't even know what a vulnerability is. So that was fairly interesting, right? In our paper, so going back to the vendor that said no one will be able to do this. So to kind of, I figured this was going to come from some of the vendors. And so what I was able to do at one point in time was, I'm down here in Chattanooga, and there's a lot of industry around us. So I was able to completely profile a company online from my house, get all the information I needed. I actually ended up watching their crane safety training videos that they had posted to YouTube, which showed me exactly which vendor they had. Then I went to that vendor and looked up the model that they had and found that the operating range in which the frequencies that they were working from were. I then went and sat in a public park near the facility that they were at with a directional antenna and was able to pull a signal for them operating their crane. I cover this a little in the paper itself, as well as other presentations. I've talked about that before, but that was actually part of the evidence that we showed them when they said no one's going to be able to do these attacks. Was here's me sniffing, figuring out exactly which protocol it was. And yeah, it took something like a vendor or an asset owner to put their information specifically on the internet, as in their training safety videos. But we can glean a lot of information from a lot of other places as well. But the point being is we can actually do this, and and as we've shown in other videos that I've shown you with the actual cranes operating, this wasn't just lab environment stuff. We were able to, with permission, control actual cranes hooked up to actual things. And the only thing that's different between the one that I even showed with the watch versus the big crane is what the motor that it's hooked to is. These are all the same things that you can buy and do from there. So from a vendor stance, if you are a crane vendor, you need to use open technologies, standards such as Bluetooth. We need to adopt rolling codes and encryption and protect the firmware. And user maintenance is because a lot of these things the users can't even maintain it. You have to get the vendor to come in and fix some of these issues because they don't really give tool sets to update something that's not even actually on connected to the network. So that's just something they have to come in with their tool sets and upgrade them. From users, we need to promote vendors to adopting open technologies, and we need to do better maintenance and update periods and periods of change of the secret pairing codes and pairing IDs. As an example, for Juuko, you could change it. The ID was just the hard set one that was there, but you need to, if you buy a new controller, you needed to pair it with the receiver. So they give you that USB tool to do this. Well, they sell it to you in their software suite. They sell it to you, but there is those options that it happens. In some cases, for some of the radios, you have to, so for Saga, you had to buy from Saga new crystals that match the right frequency. In the case of some vendors, there was just dip switches on the receiver and transmitter, so you just had to make the dip switches match to which frequency you were on. So in conclusion, patterns of vulnerabilities, there was no rolling codes. One of my coworkers, Federico, was still, I remember when we found the first one that we could replay, guys, my garage door has more security than these cranes. Or even your car, we've worked out some of the security issues, basic ones that at least help for a little bit with a little bit of the replays. So there's weak or no encryption at all. By weak, we meant that XOR. That's about as much encryption as we saw, and that's not really encryption, that's encoding. The lack of software and firmware protections, and the companies need security programs and awareness for this field specifically. As I said, we released a white paper on this. You can go to that URL or ping me later about it. I'll probably add it to Sketchd as well with my presentation. So there's that. At that point in time, just if you have any other questions.
So we don't have any questions posted through GoToWebinar, but I do want to point out that there was some jealousy thrown your way in track 2 on Discord. They want to be able to play with big RC cars too.
Yeah. That's pretty much what this was. We can control anything and everything with one. Let me turn my camera back on. And yeah, I'm sorry about the videos not working as well as they could have. So as I said, I'll post those. For anyone wanting to build a good watch that does one of these things, you can. There's been actually several follow-on researchers that have taken over the course of last year and up to today, that they've looked at war vendors specific to their own regions and countries, and have pretty much found the same things. Some of the bigger ones, vendors already have used some security. There is a couple vendors that have Bluetooth-based cranes. You know, that implies its own problems, but at least they're on a standard protocol. For most of what we saw is all the sub-gigahertz things were roll your own radio chips that they just kind of built on and you know, wrote their own protocols for control. When we're looking at the vendors themselves, a lot of smaller vendors are rebranding larger vendors' equipment. So while Saga doesn't sound big because they're in Taiwan, they're rebranded throughout the US as 3 different other brands. And once you start tearing them apart, you start seeing that some of them, they're using a lot of the same equipment, same things, and it's led on to some other research that we were looking at doing, and as well as we're finding what other controllers use these same types of basic communications over RF to control other things. As I said, the continuous miner was fun. It looks really dangerous, but you really also have to think about that thing's probably about a mile in the ground, and the ability to control it's probably really, really hard. So that's not really feasible to make a continuous miner in a coal mine go crazy.
So we did just have a question come through Discord. Sam wants to know, what are some of the more interesting failure modes, like dropping a container?
So we can't attribute I've had a question once where somebody asked me, has this ever happened? And we don't know, but one of the biggest failures that I know about from a crane stance would be there was and it's public because it happened at a nuclear plant in Arkansas, where they were doing some outage work and they ended up dropping the reactor vessel lid back on the reactor, which damaged it to where that plant had to be out for a while. There's a NRC report about the write-up about the crane's failure. So yeah, you could, if it is something that is got a ability to grab and drop. You could drop it, or the problem is a lot of these systems already have controls in case a motor breaks. They they have brakes on them. They're meant to stop and not fall. But if we get into and you have other conditions or the perfect storm type situation, you could cause some big problems. I mean, even think about if you were a partner, or sorry, you were building a building and somebody else was building a building next to you, and you were a rival for whatever, and you were able to make their cranes more or less stop. That could cause a problem. Or other things in general, just on supply chain. The one We've seen these things literally all over the place, including offshore oil rigs. Um, there's just the tow trucks actually use the same technology to lift heavy rigs, because you can't be standing there while you're tipping like a big semi back. So there, you'll notice that they're wirelessly off somewhere on some of the newer ones. Those are the exact same systems that we're discussing. I actually have a video of a mobile hoist that we're operating at some point in time. It's in that video that didn't play very well.
Great. And one more comment. We have Lisa, who wanted you to know that that was a fantastic talk and to thank you for giving it. I do want to let everybody know that after the conference, there will be a survey sent out to all the attendees. You could rate people's talks, give comments. We also have a discussion going on in Discord, a couple of CTFs going on, and we're going to take a short break. Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, if you have any questions, ping me on Discord. I'll get the presentation up to Sketch-D here in just a few minutes. And, I'm around all day, so if you have any questions, ping me. Again, thanks to Travis for all the help.